Verena de Kok completed both her bachelor's and master's degree here at the university, bachelor's degree in psychology and technology, and a master's degree in human-technology interaction. But then she decided, it's so nice here, let's stay a bit longer at this university. So she's currently an EngD trainee at the SBC, Smart Buildings and Cities program, where she's working on a company project supported by Velux. She's developing a tool to provide personalized advice for your home office. So please, let's welcome Verena and let's hear more about this tool.
Thank you, Juliette, for the nice introduction, and thank you, Velux, for inviting me here today. It's very nice to be here. I want to start by asking you a question. Who of you ever works from home? Please raise your hand. All right, then I think my presentation is nice for all of you. My name is Verena de Kok, and today I will present to you my engineering doctorate project, which is about daylight in the home office. Juliette already introduced me, so I'm not going to do it again, but in case you feel like reaching out to me, here you can find my contact information. Let me start by giving you an introduction to my project and tell you why daylight in the home office is such an important and interesting topic. The pathways of light. Light that enters the human eyes may follow two pathways. The first pathway is the image-forming pathway, and this is mainly enabled by the rod and the cone photoreceptors that are present in the retina of the human eye. And the image-forming effects of light are mostly expressed using photochromatic quantities, such as illuminance levels. And this image-forming pathway of light is mostly responsible for enabling human vision, and as such, it is related to visual performance and visual comfort. The second pathway of light is the non-image-forming pathway, and this is mainly enabled by the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or the IPRGCs in short. And non-image-forming effects of light are often expressed using melanopic equivalent daylight illuminances. The non-image-forming effects of light are more diverse, and they can range from circadian to acute effects. When we talk about circadian effects, we can say that light entrains our circadian rhythm, or our internal clock, to be nicely aligned with the natural light-dark cycle outside. And the sleep-wake cycle is the most prominent example of such a circadian rhythm. When we talk about acute effects of light, we can think, for example, about alertness effects. So light can make us feel more alert. So now that we understand that light is important for human functioning and human well-being, in the built environment, of course, we are exposed mostly to daylight and electric light. And it's very nice that electric light is always readily available to us to provide us with light. But there are many benefits to daylight compared to electric light. First of all, due to the continuous spectral power distribution, daylight covers the full visible spectrum and offers high illuminances. Secondly, due to temporal dynamics in the spectral power distribution and intensity, daylight is a natural zeitgeber or time giver for our internal clock. And thirdly, daylight is provided to openings in the facade, such as windows, and normally windows provide us with a nice view out. That's not so much the case in this room, but yeah, if you have a nice view out, then this can be related to restoration effects such as stress restoration, attention restoration, and in general it increases the pleasantness of a space. Which brings me to my last point, that in general people prefer daylight over electric light. So light is important for our well-being, and especially daylight has beneficial properties in this regard. How do we know if we are exposed to the right amount of light? In order to know this, we first need to understand what determines our personal light exposure. And the literature has identified many factors that contribute to this, which I categorized into 4 categories. First of all, we have personal characteristics, such as our age. The older we get, the more the lens yellows and the less light is available to us. Secondly, we have behavioral characteristics. For example, do we go outside during the day? Do we use a smartphone in bed? Do we use blue light blocking filters, etc. Thirdly, we have environmental characteristics, such as the location on Earth, but also the density of the environment surrounding us. And then fourthly, we have space characteristics. And I'm mostly interested in these because, of course, I'm working in the built environment. And space characteristics are, for example, the orientation of a facade, but also what colors the walls are inside a room or how far we sit away from the window. And why is this light exposure important? Well, today we spend 90% of our times, if not more, indoors. And for example, we spend a lot of this time in offices. And in order to ensure that there's an adequate lighting design in offices, this design is often guided by international or national standards, such as the EN 124641 for lighting in the workplace. And here, requirements regarding the quantity and the quality of the illumination are given. For example, it provides us with recommendations on the amount of illuminance we need on the workplace. And this is mainly related to visual performance and visual comfort. But of course, I just told you that light has many more benefits, not only making sure that we can perform visual tasks. We also have the non-image forming effects of light. So what about these? Well, currently these are quite underrepresented in these standards. But luckily for us, there are recommendations appearing on this. For example, the WELL building standards take them into account, but also recent recommendations by a group of experts, by Timothy Brown et al. And the EN 12464 is mostly related to electric lighting. And of course, I just told you that daylight has many beneficial properties. So what about daylight? Well, for daylight, we have a separate standard, the EN 17037, which provides requirements regarding daylight provision, the view to the outside, but also sunlight exposure and glare protection. But I must say that this guideline is for buildings in general, so not necessarily related to the office. And of course, since the COVID pandemic, many people started to work from home much more often than before. And today we are still working from home quite a lot. The lighting design in home offices is often just guided by what people like and prefer. And there are currently no official standards available, although we do have recommendations like this document written by NSVV and GroenLicht Vlaanderen. And of course, we again can apply the EN 17037, daylight in buildings, also to the home office, because a home office is inside a building. But again, this is quite general. So if the lighting design is not really guided by any standards, then what does the lighting design in home offices look like? Well, during the pandemic, quite some research has been conducted on this topic, and some first general conclusions can be drawn from this. First of all, and it's not unsurprisingly, I think, home office characteristics differ a lot. There are many different types of home offices. Daylight is generally highly appreciated by every home office occupant, more than electric lighting. Then, in general, people tend to be satisfied about the lighting conditions in their home office, but still problems in the visual environment may occur. For example, problems with glare, but also that people position their backs towards the window, which can lead to annoying shadows, and of course is not really beneficial to stimulate light for the circadian rhythm. And then fifthly, there tends to be quite some unawareness amongst laymen about lighting, how to properly light the home office, and people are quite willing to learn more about this. So what can we do to optimize the home office daylight situation? And this brings me to my design challenge, which is to develop a light guide for people who work from home. And this light guide has two aims. First of all, we want to create awareness about the effects of light on human well-being. And secondly, we want to provide guidance to people who work from home with the daylighting in their home office to stimulate both the image forming as well as the non-image forming effects of light. In order to tackle this design challenge, I took several steps. First of all, I looked into what do home offices in the Netherlands actually look like in terms of design and how do people evaluate the lighting. Secondly, I looked into what do these home office designs actually mean for the daylight availability? And then thirdly, how can we use all this knowledge to provide personalized recommendations to home office occupants? So let me start by the first step. What do home offices in the Netherlands look like? For this, I conducted a questionnaire study that consisted of course, the informed consent, some questions about demographics such as gender and age. Then I asked people about the characteristics of their home office space. So what is the orientation of the window? How far are you away from the window? And I also asked people what are their main tasks. So do you mostly work with paper-based tasks or more on a computer screen, for example? Then I asked people how they evaluate these characteristics. And I also asked them if they could change anything they would like about the lighting in the home office with no constraints, what would it be? What changes would they like to make? And lastly, I asked people to provide me with pictures of their home office workplace and also pictures of the window view out. If you want to read more about all the results, I wrote a conference paper on this, but for now I will keep it short. So 112 people participated in this study, slightly more females than males, and the average age of the participants was 43 years old. And people reported most often to work from home for 2 days per week. Then regarding what type of space people use, more than 50%, actually more than 60%, reported to have a room in the house that is dedicated to home office work. Then if we look at the characteristics of the space, the window orientation was quite equally divided between north, east, south and west. If we look at the window placement, 68% of the people had the window either on their left or their right side, 28% right in front of them, and then a small number of people who indeed have the window behind their back or above their head. And then with respect to the distance to the window, more than 80% indicated to sit no more than 2 meters away from their window. Then I asked for pictures, and this is not from my data, but this is an example that I made for myself. So what can we see in this picture? Besides the fact that I need to wash my window, I determined the wall color characteristics with these pictures, and most of the time people had sort of a white wall or whitish. I also determined the area of the window, so the window glazing area. I asked people to put an A4 size paper on their window, and this of course has known dimensions, so with this A4 paper I could then estimate how large the window actually was. And this ranged between 0.5 square meters to 9.2 square meters, but this was quite an outlier, so most windows range between 0.5 and 4 square meters. And then I also determined the quality of the view out by looking at how many layers people could actually see when they looked through their window. Then with respect to the open question, what people would like to change, 50% of the people approximately were quite satisfied already, so they said, for me, I don't need to change anything. And for the others, I retrieved some themes from the data. First of all, people prefer to have more light directly on the workplace. Then secondly, quite some people complained about their view out, so they would either like to see more layers or to see more greenery in their view. Then people would prefer to have better lighting solutions for online meetings. Maybe some of you recognize this, but quite often some glary faces appear when we have an online meeting or some annoying shadows in the face. And then we came at use of daylight, and this is split up into 2 parts. On the one hand, people have a desire for more daylight, and on the other hand, people want to be better able to control all this daylight in order to make the readability of the screens better, to prevent overheating from happening, but also to prevent glare. All right, so now we have a general idea of what the home office characteristics in the Netherlands look like. What are some design aspects of these home offices? What can we do with this information to say something sensible about the daylight availability? For this, I wanted to conduct daylight simulations, but then we first need to wonder, what do we actually want to simulate for? Well, first we have this image forming system, of course, with visual performance and comfort, because visual performance needs to be adequate in order to perform our tasks. And also we need to have visual comfort. So for visual performance, we need to know something about the daylight provision or the daylight availability on the workplace. And for this, I looked into the standards that I discussed earlier. If we look at the EN 124641, we have the requirement to have 500 lux at desk level in order to be able to perform our tasks well. And yeah, as I said, this is mostly about electric light, but of course we can also reach this with daylight. Then in the EN 17037, we have requirements for daylight factors that need to be met in order to reach a certain amount of illuminance on the plane in the room for at least, for example, 50% of the daylight hours per year. Then related to this, we have the spatial daylight autonomy, which tells us how large percentage of a space actually receives sufficient daylight during, for example, again, 50% of the daylight hours. So with all these combined, we know that we need a certain amount of illuminance on the workplace, and we know that we need a certain amount of daylight in the space in general. And I think a measure that nicely combines is what's the useful daylight illuminance, which tells us at a point in the space the percentage of time that the illuminance is within a certain range. So then we tackled visual performance. And for visual comfort, we mainly want to prevent glare from happening. And for this, I again looked at the daylight standards. And here we have requirements regarding the daylight glare probability. Then we also have the non-image forming system, because of course it's also important to have the circadian boost every day, although this is less common today in the standards. And for this, I looked at the healthy light exposure recommendations by Timothy Brown, in which they provide requirements for the amount of melanopic EDI that should fall on the eye during daytime. And this is for daytime active healthy adults. So then for the simulation model, I used a very simple shoebox office with dimensions that were fixed. And then I had some parameters that I changed between the simulations. So first of all, we had window orientation changing between north, east, south, and west. Then the window glazing area, I modeled it from 0.5 to 4.0 square meters, with 0.5 square meters increase in size with each step. Then for the wall color, as most offices seem to have some sort of whitish walls, I used white and gray for everything that is not white. Then I also modeled the density of the area surrounding the home office, so either a high density or a low density. Then for the type of facade, we either had a vertical facade with a window in it or a pitched roof with a roof window. And then because I did grid-based simulations, I could retrieve view directions and distances to the window by looking at different grid points in the simulation model. So if we combine all these input parameters, I have more than 6,000 options for home office configurations. And the software that I used, Radiance for the lighting simulations, embedded in the Honeybee and Ladybug interface, Grasshopper for parametric modeling, and Rhinoceros as the viewport. And then I conducted climate-based annual daylight simulations. So this means that I had for the illuminance that we wanted to know and the DGP, one value for each hour of the year for each grid point. So you can imagine that this is a lot of data. So what can we actually do with all this data to provide useful recommendations? Well, first of all, I prepared the data into daylight targets. And for this, for daylight on the workplace, I used the useful daylight illuminance, for which I chose 4 ranges to consider: smaller than 100 lux, 100 to 300 lux, 300 to 3,000, and more than 3,000. And I'm mainly interested in the third one. If we have less light than this, probably we need some electric light to complement. And if it's more, then we have a higher chance of glare happening or overheating, which we do not want. Then for the daylight glare probability, I also considered 4 ranges. Smaller than 35%, 35 to 40, 40 to 45, and over 45%. And for me, the latter 2 were most interesting here, because here we have the largest amount of people to be bothered by glare. And then we also looked at the melanopic EDI, and I was especially interested in this recommendation by Timothy Brown to achieve this 250 lux on the eye level. But then it's nice that we have all these targets and all these ranges, but still, how do we present these to laymen? Because it's still quite a lot to just give one value for each hour of the year. So how can we make this annual data understandable? Well, first of all, since we're talking about the home office, I wanted to consider only the general work hours, which are between 8 and 6. Might differ a little bit per person, but in general, this is when people work. And then we have, of course, 12 months per year, so I decided to summarize the data into the months. And then in the end, I decided to show for each month of the year the percentage of working hours that people meet a certain daylight target. Well, this might still sound a bit like, what do you mean? So I developed a tool with this, and I will show you on the next slide a video of the first version of it, the prototype. And since it's really the prototype, the video is played at a double speed, and I just want to show you the main idea behind my first ideas for the tool. So let's go. So I wanted to create a dashboard, first of all, to welcome people in the tool and then tell them what they can expect of the tool and what they should put as input. And then asking people to fill out all this information about their home office that I also used in the simulation model. So the orientation of the window, the distance to the window, the color of the walls, etc. And then people get some feedback, daylight for the biological clock. I try to make it not so scientific so that laymen also understand this. So this was the melanopic EDI, and then daylight hindrance for the daylight glare probability, and daylight at the workplace for the useful daylight illuminance. And then I asked people, what do you want to do? So if they said, I just want to redecorate, then I gave some options, for example, to change the distance to the window. And then they could fill out different options for the distance and see how it affected their daylight exposure, and same for glare and same for UDI. And then they could check out multiple things, so also the color of the wall, for example. All right, so we have the prototype, but with all prototypes, this was, of course, far from perfect. So I conducted user tests with 4 lighting experts and 5 lighting laymen, and I asked people to test the tool at home for their particular home office situation, and then to have an interview with me and explain what they thought of the tool. And I got quite some nice feedback. So first of all, people said it's way too much text in the tool, so we do not like to read that much. Secondly, the terms that I used were too scientific, so people really don't understand what is DGP or UDI. It doesn't mean anything to them. Then the graphs were unclear, which is quite fair. I think there were a lot of bars, a lot of different colors, making it a bit hard to read. Then the tool didn't provide any feedback yet, so people said, okay, so now I see this graph, but what does it actually tell me? I don't have a clue. And then they also said, well, if I want to optimize my situation for glare, what can I actually do? Because I can play around with this thing, but I don't know where to start. So taking this into account, I developed version 0.2. And this is already tested by some colleagues from Velux in Denmark, which is really nice. I don't think they are here today. I'm looking at Jens. No, but if they were, they could see I already implemented their feedback a bit, and I'm still planning on doing a feedback round with some laymen. But let's see what the light guide now looks like. So I optimized the welcoming dashboard to include less text and be more visual for people. And I quickly explained to people what they can expect from this tool. Then a new dashboard created for filling out the information that also gives more explanations to people of what is actually expected of them, what they should fill out, because yeah, sometimes things were also a bit unclear. Someone said to me, I don't really know how to calculate a window glazing area, so I try to make it more visual so that everybody understands what they need to do. As you can see, it's not optimized for speed yet. So once people are done filling out all these fields, it takes a while to calculate the results. And in the meantime, people can watch a short video on why daylight is so important for us to kill the waiting. Then we have an overview, one for daylight for well-being. And I provide some feedback also in the graph saying, like, in these months, you could improve your daylight exposure for well-being, which is the melanopic EDI. Same thing for intense daylight, which is the daylight glare probability. And I also named it a bit differently now to be more intuitive for people to understand. So, for example, for UDI, we go from little light to very much light now instead of UDI levels. And then I provide people with the option to see what they want to improve. For example, here, daylight for well-being. So first you see an overview of the situation again. And then it's explained you can do some things to optimize the situation, ranging from very not so demanding tasks to more demanding changes. So for example, changing the distance to the window to sit closer by, changing your position towards the window. If you want to make it really bold, put a new window in the facade. If that's possible, that's much larger. And then you can fill out new options that you would like to check. So in this case, I chose to only do something about my distance to the window, changing it from 2 to 1 meters. Yes, and then it takes a few seconds, and then we see what the optimized situation would do for the melanopic EDI, where we see that now in all months you receive more light to stimulate the biological clock. But of course this can have implications also for glare and for the amount of daylight on the workplace. So in case you're interested in that, you also can check out what this does. And here we see for glare, for example, it goes a bit fast, but that it's now more glary. So that's a trade-off, of course, between these two parameters. And the same for the useful daylight illuminance. We can also see what it does to this desirable range on the desk level. And then we can go back to the overview, and then a similar dashboard is created also for the daylight glare probability and also for the useful daylight illuminance. And then in the end, people can check out some general tips on which type of shading, for example, is recommended if you want to avoid glare on the screen. What can you do if you want to improve your view to the outside world? What can you do if your office is too dark? Yeah, so this is Light Guide as I developed it now. Thank you very much for your attention, and this was my presentation.